Okay, and now for our final video of this topic, evolution, does it require evidence? Well, sure it does. Evolution, while it's a controversial idea, as a scientific idea, it must have evidence to support it. So let's consider some of the evidence that suggests that evolution, life has changed over time, has occurred. One powerful piece of evidence is the fossil record. We can look back in the fossil record and find evidence that change has occurred in organisms over time. Organisms are going to die, fall into sediment, be covered over, and eventually be unearthed. And if that's the case, we say we have a fossil. Here's a little bit better view of one. Oops, sorry about that. This critter dies, it becomes starts to decompose. It's covered with sediment. Think kind of like sand or silt. It's going to cover it over in the bottom of a riverbed. Eventually, that riverbed is going to chemically change over time. We're going to have that organism become a fossil. And then maybe because of changes in the rocks, eventually it'll become exposed and we can find it. Well, does that support the idea that evolution has occurred? Sure, because you can look at patterns of these fossils. If we go back to fossils that occur way back here, and then we look at more recent fossils, we can see trends or changes in that particular fossil group over time. We can see it in the skulls of the horse, we can see it in the forefoot and in the hindfoot. So we can have evidence, you see a little better view here, that these things have changed over time. So the fossils give us sort of a glimpse of the past. They give us this record before humans were even here of what life was like. We can also go beyond just the patterns and we can date the fossils or even date the rocks the fossils are found in. By dating them, we know that that particular fossil is 100 million years old or 500 million years old. And how we date it involves using what's called a radiometric dating. We actually can look at chemical changes in different kinds of rocks and look at the elements within those and get a calculation of how old that particular rock is. So we can then begin to tie together the history of Earth and the life that's on it and create these patterns which show us over time which organisms were dominant and how each organism group changed over time. How the fossil record may be used even more specifically is to look at a particular lineage, like we were doing with horses. We can find transitional forms. We can find a bunch of different kinds of rocks that have a certain kind of fossil in it, and then we find one more that links another fossil group. That is, we kind of find the connection. If I gave you this number sequence, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, and then you found the 4, and you found the 4 in the right place in the fossil record, you would say, well, I guess all of these things link together. Transitional forms are those linking fossils that link together an entire fossil record and help us better understand what life was like. We can also look at the distribution of species. That can be a really important clue as to how life changed and when. This is called biogeography, the study of the distribution of species, where you find things. And one classic example of this is Australia. Australia has marsupial mammals as the dominant, used to have as the dominant group. And the reason is Australia was off by itself as the continents were moving, and different things were happening there evolutionarily than they were happening on the rest of the land. So by looking at the fact that we have koalas and kangaroos as the dominant group in one part of the world and not somewhere else, tells us something about the pattern of evolution that occurred. This is another example looking at some major bird groups, and by looking at where you find these fossils, we can begin to reconstruct how similar they are to each other and then reconstruct their family tree. So biogeography is another powerful piece of evidence, and the reason it's so powerful is we have direct evidence to know that the continents where they are now haven't always been there. Going back hundreds of millions of years ago, we understand how the land masses were organized or put together, and then because of changes in the rock, the continents float, and they've ended up moving, and they're still moving today. Because of these changes, and you see here Australia, right here, started moving off by itself, so it began to experience a different kind of evolutionary pattern than I'm sorry, that looks like that's Australia. It's India. So we began seeing a different kind of distribution pattern of organisms based upon their biogeography. That distribution pattern tells us something about their evolution. Some more evidence. We can look at embryos and find evidence of similarity. If you look at a chicken embryo and a human embryo, you find lots of commonality. Why would a chicken and a human have things in common? Because aren't they pretty different? This does suggest that chickens and humans have at least a distant past. Perhaps that we came from an ancestor that produced chickens and produced humans, and therefore you'd expect, if that's the case, to have a little bit of the family tree, if you will, of each in the embryos. When you look at a broader group of embryos, we're looking at fish and salamanders and tortoises and chicks and hogs and etc., you find here, look how similar these embryos all look. The similarity of embryos is another piece of evidence to suggest that all of life is connected. If there was no connection of all of these things, you would think they would all be drastically different, since the outcomes are all drastically different. Even some more evidence of comparative anatomy. When you look at a bat and a porpoise and a human and look at the bones in their forelimbs, notice how all of these, if you want to focus on the blue one, for example, all of these have the blue bone. All of these have this color here. All of them have the same orientation and distribution of the bones, but they've been modified for differences over time. Once again, it would seem to be odd or just purely coincidental that a bat and a porpoise and a human would all have the exact same number of bones in the same bone patterns if there was not some evidence, or rather some connection among all of them for evolutionary purposes. Another piece of evidence that we like to point to is more modern evidence. DNA and bioinformatics help us really understand evolution at a whole different level. Since everything has DNA, everything alive has DNA, you would think that this would be a valid assumption. The more similar two organisms are, the more similar you would think their DNA would be. The further apart they are evolutionarily, their DNA would be more and more different. That probably makes sense. So if I were to compare the percent of DNA sequences that match a chimpanzee's DNA, old world monkeys have about 92–93% similar. Gorillas, much more. Okay, humans, and of course, chimpanzees are 100%. But if you look at the pattern there, you would probably expect that humans and chimpanzees, because of some common features, would have much more DNA in common than chimpanzees perhaps would have with old world monkeys. Bioinformatics is a huge new field of genetics which looks at ways that you can compute similarity and differences based upon genetics. I think I have one more example here. Oh, I have the same example here. But when you look at differences in relatedness, drawing family trees, if you will, the more similar two organisms are, the more similar their DNA would be. The more different they are, the more different their DNA would be. Oh, I know what I had. I have this one. I knew I had one more. This shows you, we're looking here at amino acid differences compared with humans. So we're looking at hemoglobin, and so there's 0 differences between human hemoglobin and human hemoglobin. That makes sense. There are some differences with rhesus monkeys and humans, more differences with a mouse, more differences even still with a chicken, more with frogs, and more with lampreys. If I said, I want you to put together the list of organisms that have any kind of connection to humans, you're probably going to put rhesus monkeys closer to humans than a frog. And what this is showing us is that the DNA evidence bears that out. The more similar two organisms are, the more similar their DNA would be, which is another way of looking at evolution. And finally, I want to deal with another really modern example, and that is dealing with resistance. Back in the 1940s, before 1940 rather, a lot of people had illnesses that they suffered from that they just had to suffer with. There was no antibiotics. Penicillin was discovered and a number of antibiotics after that, and people took those and they could be cured from their bacterial illnesses. However, today, here in 2015, we find that more and more of our antibiotics don't work. What's going on, and why would that be the case? It seems that bacteria are evolving a resistance to our antibiotics. How can that happen? If you have a population that has variation in it, as we know populations do, not all bacteria are going to be genetically alike. This bacteria just happens to be a little bit different and just happens to have genes for antibiotic resistance. This person takes an antibiotic rather, and it actually targets and kills off the weak susceptible bacteria. So it's going to kill off the weak bacteria, in this case, most of the blue ones, but the one that's resistant is going to survive. So over time, as all these bacteria reproduce, this one, and this one, notice that more of the antibiotic resistant bacteria are there because we killed off the weaker ones, and now over time, the population is going to have more and more antibiotic resistant bacteria in the population than resistant. And this is why we see when we used to give antibiotics back in the 50s and 60s, they were almost always very effective. Now you give an antibiotic and it might not work. Well, the bacteria that you're trying to kill may have become a long line of bacteria that are now resistant to that particular kind of antibiotic. And again, how do we see this? If you have the bacteria here that are resistant versus those that are not, and you provide the antibiotic, it's going to kill the resistant one. It's going to kill the non-resistant ones, and it's going to leave the resistant ones as a bigger part of the population. That's why it may take multiple antibiotics to kill a particular bacteria causing a disease, because they're developing more and more and more resistance. Just one more final example, then we're done. We see this also not just in antibiotics, but we see this even in pesticide resistance. Here we have some critters, these white ones here. These white ones, this first generation they're calling it, these are going to be susceptible to pesticide. The red one is not. It happens to be just a genetic change, a genetic mutation. It happens to be resistant. So we spray with pesticide, and we kill most of the weak ones, and we leave the resistant one, and maybe a couple of the weak ones happen to make it. But as reproduction occurs, more and more of the population is going to become resistant. So then we spray, and now we're only killing the very susceptible ones, and it leaves more and more of the resistant ones. So over time, it becomes harder and harder to kill the pest. We have to spray more and more chemicals or develop new chemicals where in the old days they weren't. Why do you see it here? Why do you see it here? Evolution. So even though we don't look at antibiotic resistance and pesticide resistance as being evidence for evolution, it's showing you evolution in action. That is, it happens to be bad for us as we try to control bacteria that cause disease and we try to eliminate pests, but it shows you one more time that organisms are changing over time. There's a lot in this video, I know. Do go back and be able to list specific cases, particular examples of how evolution, the evidence we have for evolution. We have particular pieces of evidence that suggest evolution change has occurred over time. Make sure you know them. Thanks. Bye.